Perfect. Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Müge Finkel, Interim Director of Ford Institute for Human Security. And on behalf of Dr. Michael Kenny, Director of Matthew B. Ridgway Center for International Security Studies, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our second annual Diversity Speaker Series. This series is jointly hosted by Ford Institute and Ridgway Center and aims to bring diverse scholars and research to campus and invites us all to learn from their expertise. This year's speaker series, with its focus on Latinx scholars and scholarship, benefits from a special collaboration with the Center for Latin America Studies at Pitt. And we're very excited to have our very brand new director of class, Dr. Kayla Greenberg, join us today. As a way of formally welcoming Dr. Greenberg to Pitt, I wanted to start by briefly introducing her. Kayla Greenberg is a native of Rio de Janeiro, and she joined us at Pitt this fall. Kayla is a specialist on slavery and race in the Atlantic world. She has authored several books and articles, including A Black Jurist in a Slave Society, UNC Press 2019, which was a finalist of the 2020 Frederick Douglass Book Prize. Kayla co-directs the Public Digital History Project, Present Pasts, Memories of Slavery in Brazil. Welcome to Pitt, Kayla, and we are delighted to be able to collaborate with you and the Center for Latin America Studies for this year's Diversity Speaker Series. Now on to our speaker for this semester. We are so very excited to be able to kick off this year's series with Dr. Greta Friedman Sanchez, Associate Professor at the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Greta is a native of Colombia. She completed her graduate studies at the University of Minnesota, where she received her MA in Public Affairs from Humphrey School and her PhD in Anthropology, which she followed with a postdoctoral training at the Center for Chronic Disease Outcomes Research, VA Medical Center. Greta is the recipient of a number of research and teaching awards, as well as the Outstanding Faculty Award at the Humphrey School. Her research portfolio is anchored in questions exploring how and why gender equity or inequity is generated inside families. She has authored and co-authored books, including the 2020 publication with Margaret Grieve titled Colombia's Portal to Justice for Women Victims of Violence, the Family Commissioner Office and its Institutional Challenges, in addition to 30+ peer-reviewed articles and ever-growing list of policy reports for international organizations. Greta's latest fieldwork has taken her to Medellin and Bogota since 2015, where she evaluated the implementation of Colombia's domestic violence laws, COPAS. She joins us today at the heels of great news that the book and presentation, which are part of the same public scholarship research project, have resulted in Colombia's passage of Law 2126 this past August. This new legislation aims to improve access to justice for women victims of domestic violence. After Greta's talk, we will have close to 40 minutes for question and answers. So please use your Q&A button to submit your questions during the talk. And we look forward to a very lively discussion. Without further ado, we welcome Greta to GISPIA. Greta, thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And you can see my slides okay? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you for having me at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. It's a little bit strange to say that while I'm sitting in my home here in Minneapolis, but I truly feel like I'm there with you. I am thrilled to present this public and engaged scholarship project that has taken 5+ years in the making. As usual, one is not able to do this type of work alone. My collaborator, Margaret Grieve, was an amazing co-pilot in this project that I directed. He also was the generosity in time and information and of emotions of all judicial providers we interviewed, in particular family commissioners. Advocacy at the UN was possible thanks to the guidance of advocates for human rights the nonprofit organization based here in the Twin Cities that conducts advocacy internationally across the world, and in particular, Rose Parks and Jennifer Presthold. We also had the benefit of a grant from the Initiative of Human Rights at the University of Minnesota to conduct the advocacy and to publish the book. So as a Colombian scholar in Latin America and as a Latin American scholar in the US, I see my ethical responsibility to engage in applied public scholarship. That is, applied research that in the short or medium term may improve the lives of people. While theory, method, and peer-reviewed publications are necessary in the research endeavor, they are insufficient when it comes to public scholarship. One needs to engage with the stakeholders and conduct research on topics that are timely and relevant to communities on the ground. It means embracing the topic holistically and straddling several literatures if need be. It means communicating the results of the research with those communities in a publication venue, a style, and language that is accessible. In other words, at a minimum, it means repatriating the information of the research project. And finally, if possible, engaging the community for change. This presentation is my short and fast version of a public scholarship project that tackles the issue of intimate partner violence in Colombia. Colombia has experienced more than 5 decades of internal armed conflict. During 2016, Colombia reached a landmark peace agreement with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC as they are known, in Colombia. Earlier in the conflict, several different paramilitary groups were active, eventually banding together into the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, known as AUC. The AUC were involved in drug trafficking and other criminal activities, and after demobilizing in the 2000s, some joined criminal organizations. The armed conflict is known for its longevity, brutality, and widespread use of sexual violence. It has caused the internal displacement of 7.5 million people as of 2017, according to the UN. The FARC and the Ejército Nacional de Liberación, the ELN, the remaining armed guerrilla group, also turned to drug trafficking and illegal mining activities to finance their operations. Currently, organized crime continues to revolve around drugs, arms, and human trafficking, and illegal mining, led also by demobilized FARC dissidents, guerrillas, and paramilitaries, and now, of course, external organized crime. And although we may all think, as I thought before beginning this project, I knew what domestic violence looks like, it is much more brutal in the context of armed conflict. To make the connections, I will be providing examples. So this is an explicit warning on content. As a colleague of mine in Colombia said, ay, es que el conocimiento a veces duele. Indeed, knowledge can sometimes hurt. By international standards, Colombia has model laws on women's safety and domestic violence, nested under the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, and Colombia's human rights-based constitution, Law 1257 of 2008 and Law 294 of 1996 include exceptional rights for people subjected to domestic violence, and they recognize women's rights to security. Civil protective orders constitute the entry point to safety and access to justice. Civil protective orders have gained recognition as a critical remedy for victims of intimate partner violence. They offer the fastest and most effective way to deter future violence by providing a fallback position in intra-household bargaining to women with the extra household leverage of state protection and the threat of punishment should the violence continue. As a civil issue and with a focus on victim safety rather than punishment of the perpetrator, civil protective orders are issued based on a lower evidentiary standard than criminal cases. The most common measures included in a permanent civil protective order are restraining orders, the removal of firearms from the home, temporary awards of child support, custody, and visitation arrangements, and in some cases, mandatory parenting and therapeutic counseling. And of course, the threat of incarceration if a protective order is violated. In Colombia, Law 294 of 1996 includes all of these measures in a permanent protective order, in addition to 8 more. And we can go through those later in the Q&A if people are interested. Protective orders in Colombia are issued by the Family Commissioner. As I mentioned, in 2016, Colombia reached a landmark peace agreement with FARC. That same year, 86% of all violence cases in Colombia, political, regular crime, everything, all of the violence that received medical judicial services at Medicina Legal, this is our forensic institution in Colombia, consisted of violence against women and girls. Of these cases, 73% were perpetrated at home by an intimate partner. And women's injuries were very serious. 67% were polytraumatic. That means affecting multiple body systems. In Colombia, like in other countries emerging from conflict, the combat tactics have shifted from the battlefield to the home front, and female intimate partners are the central targets. Regardless of affiliation, combatants and ex-combatants exercise terroristic acts of domestic violence. Women have been imprisoned in sheds and chained to toilets, hacked with machetes, burned with acid, carved with knives, whipped and branded, and thrown from third-story windows by their intimate partners. Death threats, like "I will cut you into pieces and feed you to the dog," are common, as is holding victims' children at gunpoint. Colombia, like other nations emerging from armed conflict, I learned with this project, does not recognize the link between armed conflict and terrorism at home perpetrated by combatants and ex-combatants, regardless of legality status. A family commissioner, again, this is the provider, the judicial provider that issues protective orders, serving a municipality in an Andean region, provided a case that exemplifies the intersections between political, family, and gender-based violence. The case concerns 3 brothers, now ages 15, 19, and 21, whom the FARC recruited, with big quotation marks, recruited when each was 8 years old. The boys remained with the FARC for 5 years. The mother came to the family commissioner for help after the middle brother told her that his older brother was abusing him sexually. While with the FARC, the oldest boy told an officer he and others were being sexually abused. The officer lined up the children, took hold of the abuser, cut off his penis, and stuffed it into his mouth. The children, already traumatized by the sexual abuse, were re-traumatized by the sanctions' viciousness. The family commissioner issued a protective order on behalf of the middle brother, who at the time was still a minor. So what has happened? The older brother, who was 21 years old at the time of the interview, shortly thereafter was charged and convicted of femicide after murdering his 16-year-old girlfriend. The youngest brother, who is now 15, remains so traumatized that he cannot control his sphincters, and the family commissioner recently placed him under state custody for treatment. The family commissioner noted the extensive press coverage of the femicide and that it never raised the fact that the murderer and his brothers were victims of violence in the context of war. Neither the political discourse on political violence, child sexual and other abuse by kin and non-kin, or the violence against women, nor the media coverage of the femicide acknowledges the cycles of violence engendered by the conflict. I verified the account and found the newspaper and television reporting, and I don't provide, of course, the name of the town because I promised anonymity to all of my interviewees. So why conduct a scholarship that is public and engaged? Because the cycles of violence need immediate attention. A City of Medellin administrator and judicial provider stated it very clearly at the start of the project. Colombia will not find political peace until we have peace in homes. And although the focus of this presentation and of my project is Colombia, my home country, this public and engaged research approach is one that may be used in other armed conflict contexts. This public scholarship research project sought to understand the practical, legal, institutional, and cultural barriers and facilitators to the law's implementation from the perspective of judicial providers, engage with national practitioners and policy leaders to inform the study's design in order to fit local and national needs, use the results to advocate for national policy change internationally at the United Nations, and use the results to engage with national high-level policymakers to promote national legislative changes. The approach and design started with the premise that judicial providers and policymakers who are on the front line of providing access to justice to women victims of violence know what they need. And policymakers can guide researchers as to what information they need to make policy adjustments. This entailed developing relationships with judicial providers and high-level policy officials from the start of the project. Collect and analyze data in iterative cycles, provide preliminary results to judicial providers and high-level officials, which was, yes, a form of advocacy, and it provided further opportunities to collect data. Then advocating internationally, in particular at UNCIDA, we also advocated during Colombia's Universal Periodic Review the year prior. And finally, repatriate data nationally and advocate, educate, and engage with stakeholders. The methodology followed the principles of rapid assessment process without being rapid. This entailed conducting interviews with judicial providers, victim advocates, and members of civil society. We conducted 129 interviews. This is in the official data that we collected and we analyzed. We conducted many, many more interviews in setting up the project and later on after the project was, the official data collection was completed. The sampling logic followed the best worst case scenario for implementing the regulatory framework. Interviews with judicial providers were spread across 42 municipalities representing 17 departments. These included 62 commissioners, 12 members of commissioners' offices, interdisciplinary teams. These include social workers and psychologists, assistant lawyers, and secretaries. We interviewed 8 prosecutors, 6 family judges, 2 vice ministers of justice, some of the personnel working in the Vice Minister of Justice office, some personnel working in the prosecutors in the office. This is the Fiscalía General de la Nación, the National Prosecutor's Office. Interviewed international cooperation, local academics, and some victims. I can detail a little bit more about the rapid assessment process procedures and the sampling if this is of interest to anybody. Simultaneously to conducting the interviews, we were tracing Colombia's legal framework addressing domestic violence through time and its myriad decrees and laws, and then triangulated the interview data with this legal archaeology, with government reports, and with participants' observation during commissioner trainings that were organized by different entities. Participant observation also took place, of course, while we were advocating for legal reform. Key to being able to advance quickly with the project and the advocacy was the nature of the interdisciplinary team that we had. I'm trained, as you heard Muge say, as an anthropologist, which allows me a holistic view of the world, and I have a postdoc in public services. My colleague, Margaret Grieve, is a trained lawyer. And between the two of us, we had a breadth of methodology to use and complementary expertise. So what were some of the results? Prior to the year 2000, judges issued protective orders. These are judges located under the ministry, under the judicial system, under the judiciary. The armed conflict in Colombia escalated tremendously between 1989 and 2003. As the war raged in the year 2000, the state made commissioners the portal to justice with Law 575, liberating judges to deal with what were considered more serious and violent security issues. Family commissioners that until then were civil servants in the child welfare system addressing minor family issues were now to perform judicial responsibilities. In essence, the state demoted domestic violence from a public security issue addressed by judges so they could focus on so-called real security issues. So here we see the cracks in the policy silos appearing. Despite this, the Ministry of Justice argues that family commissioners are the portal to justice to women victims of violence. And of course, we'll see how this is or not is the case. In 2000, Colombia passed the landmark law called La Ley para una Vida Libre de Violencias, or the Law for Lives Free from Violence. And it expanded the protections under Law 294 of 1996, a feminist law acknowledging most victims of violence are actually women. But since 2000, when family commissioners replaced judges, they have increasingly been handed many legally mandated responsibilities under different state powers, denoted in the image that you're seeing by the different colors. Family commissioners that we interviewed repeatedly stated, we are like a Christmas tree. Anything that even remotely has to do with the family and that they cannot place anywhere else, they hang on us. The state powers include police powers, judicial administrative powers, judicial police prosecutorial powers, and executive administrative powers. And contrary to the principle of the separation of state powers, commissioners are judicial police in cases of domestic violence. This is important because it is a prosecutorial responsibility. The central mission of the Office of the Family Commissioner, serving as the main instrument of the state to address violence against women, is clearly eclipsed by the number of mandated responsibilities that they had to do. And another finding is that the law assigns responsibilities, assuming the office has interdisciplinary teams. So these are the social workers, psychologists, support lawyers. But the same law has a loophole that allows 97% of municipalities in Colombia not to have those interdisciplinary. Colombia had the opportunity to redress this grave institutional mistake in 2006, but it amplified the institutional dysfunction when it adopted Law 1098. This is the Code of Children and Adolescents, replacing the Code of Minors, and dramatically expanding the responsibilities of commissioners. This is every bubble in purple in the graphic is one additional responsibility. The law states that in municipalities without a child welfare office and thus without a family defender, commissioners will take on the additional responsibility of discharging all child protection tasks. So what we calculated is that this is not the exception as it is written in the law, since 88% of municipalities in Colombia do not have a child welfare office. In other words, they're performing two jobs, they get paid for one, and they don't have interdisciplinary teams. The state's priority of stopping men's violence against their intimate partners was downgraded clearly in 2000 and yet again in 2006. And of course, the priority of child welfare was also in 2006. Despite their judicial role, commissioners are under the control of the local executive branch of government, that is city mayors, that are regulated. That means the creation, the number of offices, the office composition by the Code of Minors, the law for the National Office of Child Welfare at the national level. To be clear, the Office of the Family Commissioner is not part of the judicial branch of government, the logical place for an office imparting justice. Furthermore, it has no oversight from city mayors, the judiciary, the Ministry of Justice, which is a national executive coordinating office, or the National Office of Child Welfare. This means that without a national coordinator, each of Colombia's 1,101 commissioners functions independently on interpretation of the law and on the minutiae of service provisioning. Similarly, without a national governing body to champion the mission addressing domestic violence, the office is a catch-all for conflicting legal responsibilities, which are 17 that, as we calculated, whose policy goals often diverge. And contrary to logic and based on an inverse formula, the number of legally mandated offices decreases as population, incidence, and prevalence of domestic violence and service needs and demands increase. On the left, we see a heat map for the city of Medellin, which assigns one family commissioner per locality, regardless of the number of cases or incidents of violence. And on the right, we see a table that summarizes Bogotá's number of cases that get seen. In intensifying colors, Bogotá has three modalities of offices: diurnal in light blue with one family commissioner, semi-permanent with two, and 24 hours, which have three family commissioners. The office in Bosa has one family commissioner. It's a diurnal office that processes 4,650 protective orders a year, 1,000 more than Engativá with three commissioners, and many thousand more than Chapinero, which has one family commissioner. And by the way, both cities have many more commissioners than is called by the law. So you can see that it's really a desperate situation here for family commissioners who are the portals to justice and for women that are seeking justice and protection. So, and this is why the entry point for women is the family commissioner. And this is why advocating became very urgent. And here we have a photograph of me and Peggy in 2019 while we were advocating at UN in front of the CEDAW committee. So what was our advocacy strategy with the CEDAW committee? And again, this is work that we were able to do with the guidance of Advocates for Human Rights. We submitted a stakeholder report in October of 2018. We traveled to Geneva and participated with the committee in an informal briefing that was an hour and a half long. We participated in the formal briefing. That means that the state is present and we presented an oral statement. We observed the review where the committee is asking the state questions and the state is responding. We handed a one-pager to committee members, which was an advocacy document summarizing the stakeholder report, which of course is bigger, and pinpointing questions that the committee members could ask the state regarding the specifics on access to justice for women. And after the review was over, we emailed committee members and we provided a brief response to the response of the state and clarify. So we had success. The 2019 testimony at the UN resulted in CEDAW recommending that Colombia provide the funding necessary to strengthen the office and to move it to the Ministry of Justice or the judiciary. The recommendations were included as priority recommendations, meaning that Colombia must respond within 2 years' time on how they have addressed the observations. And this is a huge success because treaty obligations have to be followed under Colombian law. So the advocacy in Colombia, so what was the strategy to advocate in Colombia? Of course, the advocacy started with data collection and the execution of the research methodology. In addition, I met in the summer of 2019 with the Vice Minister of Justice and provided a summary of the results and a draft of the book. I also met with USAID, which has a large gender justice program, and they have been key during the entire conflict in Colombia to strengthen the judicial institutions of Colombia. And I met with family commissioners. The advocacy continued with the publication and the distribution of the book in early 2000 in 3 formats. We distributed 1,500 copies of the physical book and sent countless emails with the web version of the book. We also published the book in almost identical form in English to continue with the advocacy internationally. I met with Procuraduría General de la Nación, which is the equivalent of an ombudsman's office, in January of 2020. And this is key because they were the office that were in charge of drafting the legal amendment that was now clearly being because of the CEDA recommendations, the state had to do something, had to respond. I also met with officials in the mayor's office in Bogota who had provided access to interviewees and who had helped with sampling. And this was another point of hoping that they in turn would provide some pressure and some guidance on the legal amendment. And I met also with international cooperation, USAID and the Spanish international cooperation. After the book was published and Colombia was moving forward with drafting an amendment, the advocacy became even more intense, and maybe some background information is necessary to understand that engagement. So Colombia's Ministry of Justice was the institution charged with filing the legal amendment in Congress. The Vice Minister of Justice was charged with putting together a committee or task force that would provide key comments on the drafts of the legal amendment. Officially, it was the Procuraduría General de la Nación, and specifically the Procuraduría's gender equity delegate, the office charged with the actual draft. But they in turn contracted with USAID to draft the law because of their access to justice program. And USAID in turn contracted with Chemonics. And so that person I was not able to interview and to debrief, but I met with the USAID contact. The first meeting with Procuraduría in January was key because they actually asked us to review the draft amendment that was in the making. So we provided a line-by-line review of the legal amendment. It is a 50-page document that provided all of the commentary, and it provided the evidence. It provided the page in the book of where the information was. And because the book had a limited amount of information, we provided more information that we have from the project on as backing or comments to the amendment, to the draft legal amendment. So we had success, and I really liked what Al Gore said yesterday in a presentation at the Humphrey School, and he said, things seem like they're going to take a long time to change until suddenly they don't. And clearly, we were preparing to do more advocacy simply by the fact that we published the report also in English, thinking of subsequent rounds of advocacy. But the legal amendment that was submitted in Congress in July 20 of 2020 was actually passed this past August. So what are some of the changes that we can trace back to our research project and our advocacy? The law removed all responsibilities not connected to the central mission of the office addressing domestic violence. Importantly, it explicitly prohibits mayors from assigning responsibilities. Those are the items, the bubbles on the left on light blue. And family commissioners do not have to do non-binding mediation on matters related to custody, support, and visitation unless they are directly connected to protective orders. These are two big wins, since these two responsibilities are a big time sink for family commissioners. Just a lot of cases involve these two responsibilities. We provided all types of evidence on why removing the responsibility of being a family defender was in the best interest of children and families and Colombia's future, but that was not removed, unfortunately. It would have involved large investments in the child welfare system, big institutional changes, financial investments, and yeah, so unfortunately, that is still there. Under the new law, the office is governed by the Ministry of Justice, and it is still located under the mayor's office. So here it's like a semi-win. The Ministry of Justice now has powers to discipline mayors who do not provide the resources to fund offices and to hold them accountable for assigning responsibilities to commissioners. And because the Ministry of Justice is the governing body, they are going to have the guidelines on interpretation of law and on procedure. So this is a big win, because the family commissioners won't be alone in these processes. And with respect to the number of family commissioners' offices, now it's following the logic of having the number increase by incidence and service demand, and it assigns an initial one family commissioner per 100,000 population. So the project was designed to engage local stakeholders, to be informed by them, ultimately reached all four objectives and ended up having its own momentum. By January 2020, 5 years after its start, the government knew about the project and were asking my colleague and I to comment on the draft amendment. By March, I was being approached to provide public comment on the finalized draft that was submitted to Congress. Despite its success, from a bird's eye view perspective, there are still huge gaps to be addressed academically, politically, and in terms of policy. So two interconnected issues emerge. First, although I advocated for the ministry's linkage of armed conflict and domestic violence to bolster political support for reform, the amendment's preamble omits this connection. Instead, it references domestic violence during the pandemic. The refusal to publicly acknowledge the links signal that women's and children's security in their homes are not security matters worthy of national level institutional infrastructure. The second is that the task force drafting the amendment, or officially supposed to be drafting the amendment or providing comment on the amendment, that task force had representation from every national office in the country, but not from the commissioners or the mayors. Those making the law really have little idea of how the battlefield is showing up at the home, or of the legal implementation challenges across institutions and inside of the Office of Family Commission. The fragmentation of the institutional apparatus meant that no official knew the entire regulatory framework, and they were proposing contradictory laws. And a lot of our engagement was actually educating the different institutions and different officials in different institutions of how the law is not harmonized and the institutions within the law are not harmonized. So that leaves me asking, so what does it take to promote women's security as worthy of institutional investment? The pedagogies of violent behavior get replicated at home through socialization, Yet the literature on national peace and security and the literature on domestic violence and women's safety are siloed, with few exceptions. There is a gaping hole in academic scholarship addressing the importance of domestic violence as part of the peace-seeking and post-conflict discourse on nation building. Violence during conflict and post-conflict is considered a political act of utmost importance, while domestic violence is considered a private matter. Moreover, if women's security is included in security and transitional justice studies, it is limited to as victims of sexual assault by a combatant, because rape and conflict is an extraordinary act of violence. In contrast, conflict-like violence tactics exercised against a partner are considered ordinary private matters, irrelevant to national security theory. Similarly, the literature on the connections between armed conflict and domestic violence is located primarily in feminist studies, in gender and development, which is my field, or transitional justice fields. The policy and regulatory cracks I found in the field are replicated academically. It is worth repeating the statistics I presented at the start of the presentation. In 2016, 86% of all cases of violence receiving medical forensic attention in Colombia were against women or girls. And of these, 73% took place at home and by an intimate partner. For the same year, forensic medicine calculated that 0.72% of sexual assault were committed by combatants. 76% of cases of sexual violence occur inside of homes. So what are some of the emerging questions that I am left with at this point of the project? I wonder why there is a systematic lack of recognition of the mutually reinforcing patterns of political and family violence exercised against women and girls. And I have focused my research and the presentation on intimate partner violence, but there could be a whole project focused on violence against girls. And what will it take to make the links recognized academically, politically, and in public policy? So my own next steps are guided by what that family commissioner said at the beginning of the project. Without peace at home, Colombia will not find political peace. So right now I'm working on a paper that captures the intensity, the frequency, and the context of intimate partner domestic terror in survey methodology, in particular, the demographic health survey, which is the main instrument that Colombia uses to assess prevalence. I'm hoping that this may be a way to convince states to fund access to gender justice. And I will leave you, all of you, and in particular students, with this question: what will and can be your role to resolve the cracks? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greta, for this incredibly timely talk, and congratulations on this amazing accomplishment. That is absolutely no small feat, and I am sure that is going to be a major part of our discussion going forward. Before I open the floor to discussion, I see that questions are being populated. I want to turn to Kayla to kick the discussion part off, and we will moderate, and we invite all of your questions on this incredibly timely and important talk. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Muge. Thanks also for the very generous introduction, and especially thanks, Greta, for this wonderful talk. I mean, it made me think of so many, I think, interesting connections. Not only thinking about domestic violence as a whole, but in the specific context of Latin America, which is unfortunately a very, very important topic nowadays, when you see the rise also of political violence and domestic violence, as you're claiming, going together. So, I mean, I have some comments, I have some questions, and I, just try to bring some, and we can go from there. I mean, just before, I very much share your perspective about the public scholarship, and also being from Brazil and having just arrived. I think this is crucial for us, for a way that we can make what we do relevant for the people that, mostly for the people that need. So I was very happy to hear you talking about that. And I was thinking, I mean, several things that are about your research, but also about the situation there in terms of before the law, or even within different contexts. How do you, how people talk about them? How do you know who are the women who suffer domestic violence in that specific case? I mean, are we talking about, are you talking about the ones that generated medical records specifically, or just going on? I have this question of breaking the silence, which is a huge one in several different countries. How do you see that? Not only, I mean, I imagine we will talk about the research specifically, but I'm thinking about how women make a case and how they break their silence about the violence that they are suffering. And if you have data or more information about when, this basic question of, if you suffer violence, when is the moment to talk? And how do you access the officials, and how much it's in the shoulders of other women, and it's implied in the connections and nets of the communities. I was also interested if in the connection between the political context and the domestic violence. If I were to be convinced, I'm not, I'm totally convinced, but if I were to be convinced that there is a rise on cases during specific periods of time, and how do they differ from the historical traditional cases of domestic violence? Someone can argue that those cases have always existed. I mean, like you, for instance, thinking about Brazil, I do believe that the cases of domestic violence are much higher now in a time of huge political crisis than before. But I was wondering how, in terms of your research, how do you claim this? Do we have numbers? And that goes with the question of, how do we know about the cases that are not officially reported, or and then I'll stop talking, because I don't want to get too much into this. Just two more questions. I was wondering how you connected with the women's movement, social movements in Colombia about this. What, in terms of the research, it seems that it's very interesting to see how the results resonated and became a public policy. But what are the connections with women's groups and social movements against violence there? And finally, this is sort of, that relates to the law. I was thinking about the law Maria da Penha in 2000, that was passed in 2006 in Brazil against domestic violence, which was a huge moment there to talk about domestic violence. And I was wondering, what is if there are any connections, and how those groups, if there is something to discuss about that, different Latin American groups and countries just getting together. You mentioned the Belém Agreement. So how are they connecting to each other and facing specific political context, but just in a wider context of domestic violence? So how those things play out. I could continue talking. I mean, I have, 2 pages of observations that I found is really interesting and relevant, but maybe we'll just pass to you, and then we can add to the QA. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla, for the questions. Let's see. So I have 5. So let's see if I can stream them. So your first one was how do we know who are the victims? So what is really, I mean, worldwide, we actually have a dearth of data. So we know we have prevalence studies, and prevalence studies usually are divided by violence that has occurred in the past 12 months or over a lifetime. They don't have a lot of information on the intensity, right? And so, and we also know that there's a lot of underreporting. So when I am talking about like the descriptions that I offered today, that some of it you can glean from the forensic information in Colombia. So those are the individuals that end up in Medicina Legal, in the forensic office. And that's basically incidents. However, in some ways that tells us some of the intensity, because it has how severe the injury was, what body parts were affected. But the in-depth descriptions of how exactly are women arriving with what types of experiences, that has come from the qualitative interviews. And so when I was doing the presentation, this is why I said, well, I thought I knew what domestic violence was until I started talking with victims and with family commissioners. And so I think one of the big efforts that we need to engage in right now is to really calibrate prevalence and incidence studies to what we are seeing on the ground. There is a lack of connection between those two right now. And of course, that means that the state has to have a better information system. So one of our recommendations also to CDOT was Colombia needs to have an information system that is attached to the statistical national system. And the offices that are receiving cases and processing cases, it needs to link up. So another semi-win is the Ministry of Justice is going to be in charge of a national data system. So it's a semi-win because the Ministry of Justice is not a data information system. I mean, they're not used to dealing with statistics. So, I think your question is addressing a big complaint that we have in the field. And here is where qualitative research is key to be able to fine tune the type of quantitative data that we are actually able to collect. So, many women actually by the time that a woman is seeking protection from a family commissioner's office, they are absolutely desperate. They're at a breaking point. And these are the women who can access the offices. Colombia's organized crime, whether that is the drugs, the guerrillas, there is a parallel system of justice here, and they're the ones who decide. So if one of these women finally is seeking access to protection from a family commissioner, they are jumping, and actually they're jumping that in many cases and putting themselves at risk. Not all family commissioners' offices. Now I'm going to link question 1 and 2. One of the questions that we had initially for family commissioners was, what type of population do you serve? What type of population do you see? And so in general, every problem that you see in Colombia lands at the family commissioner's door. So people with in poverty of income, poverty of education, poverty of housing, and and of course also partners of combatants, ex-combatants of all of those. So the willingness to come to the family commissioner's office also varies according to what population is coming to the office. The individuals, of course, who are most reluctant are the ones that are connected to the war. And of course, that is the type of violence that is most intense. Thus, the importance of actually having larger doors in accessing justice. So I don't know if I've answered your third question and how these types of cases are different from regular types of violence, but I suppose there is some research coming out from the United States that is showing evidence that service members who have served in the armed forces actually exercise more violence against their partners and family members than people who have not been part of the armed forces. And this is being replicated in other contexts. So in general, somebody who holds a weapon and is part of any armed force, even like a guard or a police officer, the levels of violence for those populations, for the wives of those populations, the partners are higher. Making the exact link is actually the cutting edge of political science right now, but there is a dearth of data on it. So this is you're asking a very important question to also actually be able to make the links politically and academically. You asked, your fourth question was regarding women's groups and women's groups specifically in Colombia. In an ideal world, initially, and I tried to do the ideal world in planning the project and in working with a scholar in Colombia and engaging with a non-governmental organization, feminist non-governmental organization in Colombia that actually has been pivotal in some of the prior legal changes. And my ideal team had been two of us scholars, me here located in the global north and another scholar located in Colombia, and two NGOs. And that model, after we started that in early 2015, that fell through. Colombia has its own dynamics with NGOs and unfortunately that fell through, and with the academic it also fell through. And she was very honest with me and said, look, I don't think that my time will be liberated. And this scholar works in a more conservative university, and she was saying, well, I may be accused of breaking families. So at the end, it ended up being, the team that you heard me talk about. The changes have been very recent. I actually found that only like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, so I haven't been able to loop back, and I'm planning. And of course, COVID has made everything more difficult. Colombians are very good at answering WhatsApp, but it's very hard to engage with WhatsApp. So it's, as we say, el santo hace el milagro. So you have to be in person to really be able to connect. So I hope that in my future travel to Colombia that I'll be able to, as I usually do, I connect with a few people and your last one on the social movements in Latin America, that's not my area of expertise. I know from colleagues that also work on domestic violence that if, for example, in Central America, the movement is going exactly in the opposite direction. Gains that had been made 10 and 15 years ago are very recently being reversed because of governments that are accusing the feminist movement of wanting to break up families. the work of Shannon Drisdale is exemplifying this for Central America.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful start, which I did not. I fully expected that this will be a conversation that is going to take more time than we have. And Kayla, thank you. This was like a great way of entry to many of the questions that I'm watching come up and the question and answers. We have right now 8 of them. Some of them kind of come into contact with the different questions, and everyone starts by telling us how much they're grateful for this talk. So I will put it out there at front. Everybody is like enjoying, and it has prompted so many questions and important issues that we want to bring up. So Kayla, how would you foresee? I have 2 burning questions, but I'm going to be very patient with myself, and I'm going to hold until we go through our participants. So shall we take one at a time? Maybe go through the list?
Yeah, go ahead. You start first and then I go.
Sounds great. So we have a participant who is asking, would you say there are any barriers specific to Latinx victims going through the legal system to try and get relief from their abusive relationships? And if so, any impacts on mental health that can be aware of?
That's a great question. Because family commissioners have dual responsibility of being family defenders and family commissioners, actually most of the cases that we heard of the LGBTQ community coming forward to family commissioners were children with parents who were mistreating them after finding out of their orientation. And so those were the challenges. We heard in particular in Bogota and Medellin a lot of openness on the part of family commissioners of bringing all of the protections necessary for these young adults and also adolescents. We did not hear a lot of cases for intimate partner violence, but that may have been, that's definitely a project that it's worthy of its own. And of zeroing in. We were flying very high in the study, so focusing on particular populations was hard because it was, the broad implementation of the law. And so we could ask, for instance, some of the gaps that I'm very aware of is, what are some of the challenges for indigenous populations? What are some of the challenges with Afro-Colombian populations, which I would imagine are different?
Well, thanks so much. I'll pass then to the second question, which is, while presenting your findings in various arenas, did you ever feel that nothing would come of your research and no action would be taken?
Absolutely. Yes. This is why I so like what Al Gore said last night. It's like, yes, you actually think that nothing is going to happen. And so you're preparing all types of documents and different types of languages and venues, hoping that, you can make a difference somehow. I think that the next thing on the agenda, and this is not necessarily my agenda, some of you can take it on, is advocacy on behalf of child abuse, because it's pretty terrible as well. So yes, so absolutely. It's I think it's also, I mean, you can work very hard and do the work and be very good at it, but chance also has its role in life. I was surprised. We right now have a conservative government in Colombia. And I thought, no way anything is ever going to happen. And I think in part, when we were approaching and I was approaching officials there, I always tried to be very, very neutral and to really put forward the heroic efforts of family commissioners and hearing women and in working against all odds. And I think that message was heard, right? It's not in an accusation of the state, and it wasn't a combative approach, and I think that helped.
Fantastic. So I'm going to try to combine two questions at once, and let's see how that's going to work. I think it is coming from Dr. Taylor-Sebold and Michael Kenny. They are both interested in terms of your advocacy efforts. Dr. Taylor-Sebold asks, have you encountered any opposition or hostility toward your research or advocacy? And if so, whether they were clustered in certain particular areas, sectors, whether it's rural, urban, local police, etc. Whereas Dr. Michael Kenny hopes that you will be able to elaborate a little bit more in terms of what made your advocacy so successful.
Great questions. Thank you. I'm not aware of any opposition to my advocacy. And I'm going to combine both questions. So what made the advocacy successful? So let me give you an example of recruiting in Bogota. We had an opening in Medellin to do interviews through contacts that we had had, and we started, actually the project started in early 2015, doing a feasibility interviews in Medellin, and there it became clear that there was interest in please help us. Family commissioners are really desperate because they have so much work to do with so little resources. Because the design of the study was the best and the worst case scenario, of course, interviewing in Bogota and finding out how is the implementation of the law happening in Bogota, that was key, because Bogota is the best case scenario. If you cannot implement in Bogota, you cannot implement anywhere. And when we arrived in Bogota, an official from the mayor's office was very reluctant. So there was some opposition there. And and I'm not sure why she was reluctant, but we present ourselves as neutral, of course, I'm Colombian, but I'm based in the US, and my colleague Peggy Grievous, clearly American, has a heavy accent when she speaks. I'm fluent, of course, in English. In English, I'm fluent. In Spanish, imagine I'm native. And the official was, it took multiple letters. It took actually arriving to the office at 8 in the morning. And sitting there, and the secretary saying, well, she's very busy, you'll have to wait. It's like, yes, we will wait. And finally, she's like, okay, I have 30 seconds from here to the parking lot, and you tell me what you want. It's like, we got it down. So selling the idea that, Bogota and family commissioners and everybody's doing such an incredible job, but clearly everybody needs help in how can the job that they're doing be done even better? And I think that approach of, yes, we recognize that you're working very hard and you need help to do your work even better, really helped because, again, it wasn't combative. And so the approach of, so that's one instance, and I'll answer your question. Then we approached the Ministry of Justice. We met with the vice minister, and the vice minister was saying, well, we really need information from conflict areas. It's like, well, to go to conflict areas, like we would need protection. It's like, well, no, we can't do that. But what's the closest? The closest is to go to a region in Colombia that has had a lot of conflict. And so we did that, and he facilitated the individual within the Ministry of Justice to sample what would be the best sampling that fit their needs, that fit our academic needs, and facilitated the access. The same happened in Bogota. We said that we need in Bogota, not all localities are the same, but we cannot possibly interview 80 family commissioners in 32 localities. So help us with the sampling. Help us tell the story of, we want the maximum variation in the sampling within Bogota. So we need family commissioners who are providing orders, providing access to justice to women that are high class, upper class, wealthy individuals that are in the poorest areas of Bogota, sections that are more industrial and so on. And so it was the way that we sought access and the way that we did the sampling that was in concert with officials that facilitated the local advocacy in the beginning. And so this is why I had the graph of the upside down spiral, because in the beginning, we were approaching all of these officials saying, this is the design, this is the question that we think is important. Please tell us, is it important for you? And if it isn't, how can we adapt? What areas do you need information from? At the end, it really started gaining its own momentum when we started being invited by USAID or by a group of family commissioners that were getting together to do training and saying, we're doing training on this and this date. This is an opportunity for you to, number one, see the training, and number two, maybe recruit and do some interviews. And USAID offered us the possibility of doing interviews with family commissioners from areas of conflict that were coming to Bogota to do a training. So we did interviews there. And so that generated between the large mayor's offices, Bogota and Medellin, with the Vice Ministry of Justice, with USAID, the key information that they were involved from the start. And at the end, they wanted to know, when do you have the results? Do you have the results? Do you have a summary? And the book and the publication, it became very timely because in some ways, now that I think of it, we started being pressured by our own success at CEDA, because that put pressure on the government. And now we had pressure to write up the results and deliver them and turn around them fast. So it ended up, I think the beginning of how we approached the design and involved officials in all types of officials that made the advocacy successful. Did I answer the question?
For sure. I'm going to address a question by Dean Slaughterback, which thanks you and says that your research is so important and has so much potential for impact. So at the same time, there are so many challenges in doing this kind of field-based work, especially around an issue that is so personal and heart-wrenching. How do you think about self-care as a researcher? And what advice do you have researchers interested in doing work of this kind?
Wow. Well, first of all, I'm thrilled, Carissa, that you have been watching this, and thank you so much for the invitation. That's a really intense question. And my family and friends will attest that over the past year, I've been tired. I've been, it's been a lot of work, but it's also really hard work. I don't think I had ever cried during an interview. And the last interview I had with a family commissioner in Bogota, I lost it because the conditions of work were such that it was like, oh my God, she brought out a box with a box because there is this thing in Colombia called the El Derecho de Petición, and it is like the Information Act in the United States. So when a person that has been accused and that now has that is a perpetrator doesn't like the result, they ask for a petition of information, and that puts the family commissioners under pressure because they have to respond within 10 calendar days. That is what the Constitution says. It's a constitutional right. And people in the community know that they can drown family commissioners in work. And so not only are family commissioners hearing of violence, they're actually in some ways receiving violence from the citizenship. When I heard that, I lost it. And writing all of this, thinking about not only the violence that women experience, but that family commissioners experience has been difficult. So I needed a break from writing. The book came out in December of 2019, and I wrote an article, and now I'm reviewing it. But yes, it was hard. It was hard, and I dived into an article on public and engaged research because I needed a break. And I can tell you that my garden is looking absolutely fantastic because it is the way that in the summer, this past summer when the project was, when we finished the publication of the book, I just needed a complete break from it. And so also, you know, other things, knitting, cooking. I love the domestic arts. So for me, that's a way to really be able to disengage. But it is a really important question, and one that I myself wonder, you know, for how long can I continue writing about this, because it is hard.
Thank you, Greta. We have 2 more questions on the list, and we have about 5 minutes to go. So I'm going to apologize in advance because I am not really dying to ask one question at least. So I'm going to break into the queue. And then Julia, I truly hope that my colleague Julia Santucci has a great question, and we're definitely going to get to it at some point. I wanted to ask you, Greta, it's like while listening to you, I kept thinking, have we missed the opportunity with 1325 UNHCR is like the point about the UN condition that the woman has to be part of the peacemaking process, and we celebrated its 10th anniversary, and this at the highest level commitment to making women part of the peacemaking process. And with your research, we see that as long as that peace process is understood for conflicts that are only in public, it seems to me that was a missed opportunity, unfortunately. Yes,
I agree. It was a missed opportunity because it is, and I realize I have it in the slides, but I didn't explain it. Resolution 1325 actually only of the UN only addresses sexual assault in the context of conflict. And so transitional justice agreements all revolve around that. If they incorporate women, it is only it is with that respect. So in Colombia, for instance, in our own transitional justice agreements, there is no recognition of this type of linkage. I'm not sure what it will take to be able to have this addressed. I participated in one of the seminars organized in the US around the anniversary or the commemoration rather. And I asked the question I kind of got no answer. The answer was, well, this has been very, very important. There is still a lot to be done. So yes, I think I have the same question. Yes. And to me, it's like, it's so obvious, but I would flip around the question and what I mean, of course, my area is gender and development. I'm not an international studies person. I'm not a political scientist. I realized from my political science colleagues that feminist international relations is hard, that's a hard field. it's not easily inserting feminism into international relations has been difficult. Let's put it that way. So if that has been hard, imagine making these linkages. So yeah.
If you were to put a plug in for more women in higher levels of decision-making positions, do you think that that played a role in your success in Colombia? Because Colombia often kind of is being celebrated as one of the 10 countries where women in ministerial positions have been above parity. So do you think that was one of the ways in which, as hard as your road has been, it indeed was successful, as you noted? Do you think that played a role?
I don't know, because I'm not privy to what were the discussions happening in Congress when the bill was being debated. I communicated with the liberal feminist senator, and I didn't get a response, but I know that she got the documentation. From an advocacy perspective, I know that many of the individuals that I talked with actually were women. And I think that made a difference because the style of communication is different. And there is more of an opening and less of a hierarchy when, and in Colombia, I mean, Colombia clearly is a country that still has a ways to go in terms of gender equity and the way that men perceive women. So I think the fact that a lot of the high officials that I was connecting with were women made a difference. And yeah.
Thank you. And Kayla, I think Dr. Julie Santucci unfortunately had to leave, but she had one question for us maybe to think about if we can answer right now. And that was, what was being addressed? What was being done to address the trauma for former fighters that as they kind of have to reintegrate in the society?
That is outside of my area, so I'm going to defer to others that have the expertise. I want to thank all of you again for inviting me and for all of the organization and the great questions. And if anybody's interested to know more about this, to be engaged somehow, maybe in your own contexts, you have my email from the documentation, and Muge, of course, has it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. We truly appreciate everyone, starting with our speaker and with incredibly thought-provoking questions. And I want to take this one last minute to thank everybody who kind of contributed for making this wonderful talk happen. We'll start with the Center for Latin America Studies. Kayla, we're so happy that you're part of this organization, and we hope that this was the first of the many collaborations to come. We want to thank Dean Slaughterback and Gispia. Carissa connected us at the first time, and I know that this will not be the last time, Greta, that we'll be reaching out to you and finding ways in which we can bring you to our faculty conversations and student conversations. Gispia Student Cabinet and Students of Color Alliance, they're going to be hosting Greta tomorrow. It's 6 p.m. for a heart-to-heart discussion about being the scholar that Greta is and doing the kind of scholarship that she does. And I know that they will very much appreciate this conversation. And last but not least, our exceptional center administration, Sandy Monteverde for the Ridgeway Center and Diane Cohn from the Ford Institute. Thank you for organizing the event. Thank you for making sure that it went seamless, and we would be lost without you. So please, everyone, keep your eyes and ears open. We will, for the spring semester, next part of our diversity speakers, we are going to continue to focus on Latinx scholars and scholarship. But Greta, you're leaving us with very, very big shoes to fill. So thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.